the Apache Web Server. In this nugget, we're going to talk about the Apache Web Server. We'll look in depth at the Apache configuration file, and we'll learn how to restrict access to your web server, and we'll also talk briefly about the logging capabilities that are built into Apache. So let's get started. Let's start by talking about the Apache Web Server, and the latest version of Apache that's out there is version 2.0. Now, I recently read on the internet a survey that said that 65% of all the web servers out there are using Apache. Okay, now that's a pretty strong statement, right? Because this is a piece of free software, but it shows just how important Apache has become in the world of the internet. Okay, and Netcraft is kind of a cool website. You can go on there and look at various domains out there on the internet, like Microsoft.com or Yahoo or Google or whatever, and it does a little probe of the websites, and it tells you what web server they're using and also what the underlying operating system they're using, if it can determine that information. Okay, so so this just says Apache's an important piece of software, especially for Linux. Most of the Linux people, most of the servers out there that are running Linux are running Apache to go along with it. But Apache 2.0 has made a lot of modifications so that it will run well on other platforms besides Linux. Now, we did an installation of Apache back in the introductory videos, so I'm not going to walk you through in a whole installation of Apache, but I just wanted to refresh your memory as to what the packages are that you can use, or that you can install to have like the full kit and caboodle with relating to Apache. Okay, and these are all RPMs, so you'd have to install all these RPMs to have the full deal. Okay, first one here is HTTPD, and that's the actual web server itself. HTTPD-devel is for development tools for the web server, so you can do things like compile in new modules and stuff. Red Hat config HTTPD. This is a graphical user interface to help with the configuration of the web server. HTTPD-manual. This is for documentation for the web server. And if you install this RPM, the documentation is going to live in /var/www/html/manual. Mod Perl and Mod Python are both language interpreters for the respective languages for Apache. So this is a Perl interpreter for Apache, and this is a Python interpreter for Apache. Mod SSL allows you to support encryption, so you can use protocols like secure HTTP. AutoConf is for creating scripts. This is for make files, and LibTool is just some generic libraries, some shared libraries that you're going to need for Apache. Okay, so there's the packages that you'll install, all those packages, if you want the full functioning version of Apache. Now, in terms of starting and stopping Apache, there's two run level 3, and then the daemon will start automatically at that run level. Okay, another way to do this exact same thing here is to use the graphical user interface tool, Red Hat-config-services, which we've used earlier in this series for configuring some other service to start automatically. And then what you do is you pick a particular run level, like run level 5, and you scroll down the list looking for Apache to check that box so that will start up. Actually, you're not looking for Apache, the word Apache, you're looking for HTTPD, right? That's the name of the service that you're starting when you're starting and stopping Apache. Okay, so now let's move out to the Linux screen and look at some of the configuration files and some of the other stuff related to Apache. Then we'll come back to the whiteboard again to talk about restricting access to your web server using Apache. Well, let's look at the configuration file for the Apache web server. That's in the etc directory under HTTPD, under conf, and the file is called httpd.conf. Okay, so this configuration file you'll see is like the most well-commented configuration file you'll ever see. It's got a detailed description for every single variable that's set or every single directive that's set. It has a detailed description of what it is just above the setting of that particular variable. So in this case, server root equals etc httpd. Well, what's server root? Well, here it tells you server root is the top of the directory tree under which the server's configuration files, error files, and log files are all kept. So this tells you where to look for configuration files, error files, and log files, and we found the configuration files under etc httpd/conf. Okay, so again, it's telling you exactly what's going on. Notice here it says do not add a slash at the end of the directory path. That's important. It tells you that so that make sure that when you edit this, if you wanted to change what the server root was, you don't put a slash at the end. Okay, so as we page down here, you'll see all sorts of variables. If you want to experiment or investigate what all of these things are, just read the descriptions, and they tell you pretty much what they are, just so that they can do all the things necessary for the Apache web server, but they can't do other stuff. Okay, and here's why this is good. Because just say you had a script on your web page that went awry, either because you wrote it incorrectly, or somebody's cracked into your system and altered the script somehow. Okay, if that script was actually running as like the root user, then the potential danger is a lot greater. Okay, if the script was running wild, deleting files, for instance, or something like that, and it was running as the root user, well, nothing would stop it because the root user has full privileges. But if it's running wild as the user Apache, then not a lot's going to happen, because Apache doesn't really have that many privileges. Okay, so it's important to leave these both set to Apache. Do not change them to something like root, for instance. Okay, if we page down, you'll see a server admin. This is the email address of the administrator of the server. Server name, it's just set to localhost by default. But if you had a domain name here like www.cbtnuggets.com, that's what you would write here under server name. Okay, as we go down a little farther here, I want to show you a couple other things. Document root, this is where your HTML documents will live, /var/www/html. Okay, if you want to change that, you can alter this address. Again, make sure you don't have a slash on the end of that particular listing to make sure that it goes to the right directory. All right, well, now I've paged way down in httpd.conf here, down like 20-some pages of stuff, to get to this section, because we're going to move back out to the whiteboard to talk about this in more detail. I just wanted to give you a little glimpse of what goes on down here at the bottom and what's actually happening. What we're doing down here at the bottom of the configuration file is restricting access to our web server in some way or another. We're either restricting access based on what machines can access these directories that we're talking about, or we're going to restrict what kinds of operations can be done in these directories. And you'll see in more detail once I explain all the various options and things like that when we go back out to the whiteboard exactly what's going on. HTML page that I've asked for. I've said redhat.com/files. I'm asking for a particular directory. Well, what the web server will do will look for index.html by default in that particular directory. If index.html does not exist in that directory and the indexes option is set here, if I say option indexes, then the web server will do a directory listing of that particular directory to help the user navigate and find the files that he's looking for. Okay, if options includes is set, that means that server-side includes are allowed in this directory. A server-side include is just something that gives a little bit of dynamic content to an HTML page, like the current date or the current time or something like that. Okay, and it's not a full-on like CGI script, but it is a little bit of dynamic content, and that is allowed if it says options includes on a particular directory. Follow symlinks. It means that the user that's on the web page can follow a symbolic link to some other directory. You should be careful if you set this. You should be aware of where all your symlinks are going in your document root there, where your web pages are. Make sure you know where all the symlinks are going, because if somebody can follow symlinks, if you set this option, then they might be able to get to some other part of the file system that you didn't intend them to be able to get to. Exec CGI says that you can execute CGI scripts for this particular directory. And multi-views just has to do with, there's this weird thing about if a particular document isn't there or it can't be found, then the server tries to figure out which document is the best one to show you. Okay, if you want help configuring this, look into the mod negotiations module or the Apache manual talking about mod negotiations. Okay, so in addition to these 5 things here, you can also set options directives as all or none. Okay, none is obvious. None of these are included. All includes the first 4. Multi-views is something separate. You have to explicitly say that you want that included. All does not include that by default. Okay, so if you say all, you'll get all 4 of these enabled for your particular directory. Now, this is one way to restrict access. Another way to restrict access is with the allow and deny qualifiers. Okay, so what I'm doing here is I've put a little snippet of the configuration file, what I would include in the configuration file if I was trying to allow access from a particular domain. So the way this starts is by saying order, deny, allow. So this says process the deny fields first, then process the allow fields. So here I'm saying deny from all, allow from cbtnuggets.com. So this is what this is doing, in effect, is saying deny all traffic. Nobody can look at this web page unless they're from the cbtnuggets.com domain. Okay, so that's the way you can set this up. If you switch the order here, if you say order, allow, deny, then the allow parts are done first, and then the deny parts are done second. And the deny part, if I just said allow from cbtnuggets.com, deny from all, then nobody would be able to access my system because the deny thing would take precedence because that's the second thing I checked. Okay, so that's kind of the way this is working. Another way to restrict access to your system. And one last way I want to talk about restricting access is using passwords to restrict access. So we're not talking about the same passwords that you would use to log into the system. We're going to create a separate password file. It's going to have a similar structure to Etsy password, but it's going to be specifically for the web server. Okay, so the way that we create this password file is we say htpassword, P-A-S-S-W-D, -C for create. Then we create the file name. Here I've called it web users, and then the username is Perry. Okay, once I type this command in, then I'm going to be prompted for a password for Perry. I would type that in. It would show up as just blank characters, and then it would then put an encrypted version of that password in this web users file. Okay, so then if I want to add more people to this file, I would say htpassword. I would leave out the -C because this was creating that file. I would just say htpassword web users Joe. Okay, and then Joe, and then I type a password for Joe, and then Joe would also have an entry in the web users password file. Okay, so that's the first step, is creating the actual password file. And then to get then what this is saying is that I am allowing I am allowing this rule, options none, to be overridden by rules in a local .htaccess file. So let's pick a subdirectory here. Let's say I've got this subdirectory var www html/Perry. Okay, well, in this directory, if I've got this allow override options directive set in httpd.conf, then in this particular subdirectory, I can create a file called htaccess. Okay, and in that particular file, I can say something like options includes. Okay, now what this would say is that I am allowing server-side includes in the Perry subdirectory of var www html and all subdirectories of this Perry directory. Okay, so this file then sort of takes precedence over httpd.conf because I've said I'm allowing overrides of the options directive that I just said. Okay, now what's the effect of this? What's the purpose of this? Well, presumably, in this example here, Perry is my directory in like the web space. Okay, so this is where all of the web files will go under var www html, and maybe I've set aside a bunch of directories for Perry, Joe, Bob, whoever, as their personal directories so they can have their own space on the web server. Okay, so I would have ownership of this directory. So I would also have ownership and writing capabilities to my local .htaccess file, so I can set up my particular subdirectory however I want. Okay, so this is nice because then the users get some control over how their particular subdirectories are, what capabilities they have, whether they all have server-side includes, whether they can execute CGI scripts, that sort of thing. Okay, so that's a reason that people might want to use .htaccess files. Okay, but there's a real problem here, or a caution. Okay, so beware. Using these .htaccess files, what this can do is it can actually end up impacting server performance. Okay, so I'm going to say it can. So that is the last way that I want to talk about restricting access to your web server. And now let's talk about logging capabilities of Apache. All right, so here we are back on the Linux screen, and we're in the httpd.conf file again, and we're looking at the section of the file that refers to logging. Okay, so logging just means the information that we're keeping about activity on our web server. Okay, the first directive here is error log, and that just tells me the location of the error log, /var/log/httpd/error-log. Okay, then the next directive is an important one. This is the log level. Okay, so this is saying that what type of messages should go into the error log. All right, and there's all these categories of messages: debug, info, notice, warn, error, crit for critical, alert, and emerge for emergency. Okay, so basically, as we pick log level warning, what that means is that anything with a warn, an error, a crit, an alert, or an emergency level would be logged to our error log. Okay, but things like with debug, info, or notice levels would not be put into the error log. Okay, and if you do put, if you do loosen this restriction from warn to notice, for example, then the number of messages in your error log will increase because more messages meet this looser criteria. Okay, so that's why they say it controls the number of messages logged to the error log. All right, but the two most typical values for a log level would either be warn or error on web servers that I've seen. Okay, so that's for the error log. Now, the other thing here that they've got is a set of log formats. Okay, and this looks like a big bunch of gobbledygook, okay, a bunch of percent signs and letters and things like that. But basically what you should get out of this is that there's this log format and it's called combined. There's another log format called common. There's another log format called referrer, and there's another log format called agent. Okay, if we want to use one of these formats, then down below here, let me just page down a little, you'll see for our custom log for our particular installation, which is in the log/access log is what it's going to be called. And notice there's no leading slash here. So this is saying using the basic root of our server, which is /etc/httpd. Then it would be /log/access log. That's where that would be kept. We're using the combined format for that access log, which says we're using this line from above, and each line in the access log will have this format. Okay, now what does this format mean? Well, each of these things means a particular item is logged to our particular log file. So %H would mean the remote host is there. %L would be the remote log name. %U would be the username that they use if this was an authenticated part of the web server. So if they had to type a username and a password, %U will be the username that they use to get in. %T is the time. Okay, so each of these things means something. There's a whole bunch of other options that we could put inside of the quotes here. We could put in, %A for the remote IP address and things like that. Okay, there's just all sorts of information we can keep track of. And if you want to add something to keep track of it, add it into this particular format. And then down here, when it says custom logs, we're using the combined format. If you added something to the combined log format here, it will begin to show up in your actual access logs. Okay. If you want to see the whole list of different items that you can put into a log file, then you refer to the Apache manual. They've got the whole list there. Refer to a book about Apache or something like that. And there's just a whole slew of different pieces of information that you can put into that log file. All right, well, that wraps up our discussion about log files. Now let's just wrap up this nugget. All right, well, it's time to wrap up our nugget on the Apache web server. We talked quite a bit about the configuration file for the Apache web server, which is located in this directory, and the file is called httpd.conf. Okay, we talked about the rules and the directives in this particular configuration file so that we could restrict the access to our web server, restrict the capabilities of our web server. So we could restrict the access to our web server from certain machines. We talked about the allow and deny directives so that we could allow access only from our particular company or something like that. We also talked about restricting the capabilities of our web server, whether the web server could run CGI scripts or server-side includes on a directory-by-directory basis. Okay, so that in the conf file there was an entry for each directory and the kinds of things that could be done in each of those directories. We also talked about using authentication to restrict access. So we could make a particular part of our web server, directory on our web server, accessible only to people that had a username and password that we set up. Okay, and so this is another way to restrict access. We also talked about the .htaccess files and overriding the option set in httpd.conf, and I told you that while that is a valid measure that it can actually work, it's not necessarily a good way to go about things because of performance reasons. And finally, we just talked briefly about logging and the types of information that you can have put into your log file. Well, I hope you found this nugget informative, and thanks for watching.